Good evening. We're going to try to answer the questions of the viewers. I've got my colleagues, Pnina, Sharvit, Baruch, head of the Law and National Security Program, and Itai Brun. Unfortunately, Moshe Bar-Siman-Tov, for personal reasons, couldn't join us at the last moment. We answer the questions of the public. Orit is asking us, is Israel preparing for the possibility that the coronavirus is going to accompany us in the next 5 years? What do we have to do so that we can cope with this virus in time? Is it going to change our style of life and the way we cope? Well, first of all, I really hope that Israel is preparing itself, because I think that now really we have to work with two scenarios. One, with the inoculation, we hope that the pandemic is going to dwindle. The other possibility that it's not going to happen, that the pandemic will continue, variants, whatever. So this is perhaps a scenario that every day that passes seems like it is not unreasonable to have this scenario. And I hope the country is preparing itself. And I think that in such a situation, we really will have to go to a phase in which we live together with the pandemic or with the virus as part of our life. We don't stop life. You know, there are other diseases as well. There's cancer, and there are car accidents and air accidents. So we have to continue to live. And I think that in this situation, we may open everything, but together with that, we will have to define regulations and rules in order to reduce as much as possible the spread of the virus. Now here we're talking about the element of how to do it in a way that both the public will be able to live with it, and the economy can thrive, and the education can go back, and also to bridge the gaps that have been created, not just in Israel, by the way. We saw it in other countries as well. A lot of problems of lack of trust in the rules, if it goes on and on and on, yes. But you know, already between the first lockdown and the second and the third, that's what happened. And I want to go back to the recommendations that were given by the committee of experts. We remember the experts of the Weizmann Institute that was a consultant of the National Security Board, and I was asked to prepare some sort of principles. The principles, guidelines for severity or alleviation of the virus. And I looked at it, and I'm telling you, let's see. These were the principles. One, to respect the human rights. There are all sorts of limitations on freedoms, whether it's freedom of movement, of occupation, or privacy, only when there's no other choice. Last resort. Second, balance. The limitations have to balance the health risks to other risks, where you talk about the economy and the social issues and mental issues, and also fairness. The limitations should be fair as much as possible, and not to distinguish between this business or another. Fourth, information about the logic of the limitations. It has to be transparent. It has to be there be a possibility to explain it, to have simple regulation, not to change them every 2 days, to enforce the regulations, and if you cannot enforce, it should just be recommendations. Limitations that the public can live with for the time needed. Namely, you cannot continue throughout the time. Maybe a few limitations, yes. But the other thing is to give a freedom of choice, because the limitation is supposed to defend, let's say, the elderly. They can decide for themselves. And the last three, relating to special needs of certain populations, and also the implications of the limitations, and also to give some sort of a solution to the ramification of these limitations on other realms of life. If they had implemented it at the time, and if we can, there's to be a modus vivendi we can live with. Itai. Yaakov Lotan is asking us whether the continuous failure in the control of the crisis, this is what we can expect also in security. You see, people are not compliant. We don't have a joint purpose, or so-called. I think there are two aspects. One of them has to do with the decision makers, and the other one is the public at large. The decision makers, on the face of it, in the security system, it is very established. It has experience with strategic and operative objectives, a doctrine. All that we didn't have in the Corona period. But I think that the difficulties that we saw in the process of decision-making during the pandemic actually reflect something much wider. We've been saying for quite some time that even what we call the war cabinets and the Chief of Staff Office, they also suffer from difficulty to actually clarify the reality, understand it, and make decisions. And this difficulty derives from a lot of factors. They go into the decision-making process. It's like an aquarium in a sort. From the inside, you see what's happening outside, and vice versa. It's very difficult to make decisions. And we have all sorts of considerations, political, technological, social, just as we saw in the pandemic, this difficulty to make a decision, to implement, and I think we might see that in the security crisis as well. There as well, we'll have to grapple with the phenomenon of many truisms, all sorts of stories and rumors, whatever. And how will that impact the conduct of the public? Will they not comply as they don't today? Well, the public is a very good question. What we saw in the past with security crises, there was a poem talking about the life of this puppy. Usually when there was a crisis, everybody would mobilize. I think life today are much more difficult, much more severe. And I think it has to do also in the context of war. In history, there were wars. If it's a war of choice or if it's a war of no choice, there were problems of solidarity. But it depends on the context. In general, as opposed to many things that were said today, I think that the crisis that typifies the Israeli society is not the largest and biggest in our history, and definitely not in Western countries as well, because there the problem is in the level of decision-making, not the crisis itself. Let me add my opinion. The longer the crisis, usually security crises, they're more condensed, they're shorter. The moment that the crisis continues, people cannot be living in tension forever. But the Israeli society has grappled in a lot of wars that took a long time, and they coped very well. Depends on the reason. Why are we fighting? Well, let me add another thing. We came to this conference with a certain world perception that national security is now coming inward instead of outward, and the public is more troubled with the challenges of within. Is it true to transfer budgets from security to deal with economy, society, welfare? These are the problems that are really burning at the moment. Well, the answer is that I think yes. I think what we're trying to do, even in this conference and in INSS, is to offer a joint framework. You can deal with the external threats, internal threats, that there'll be some sort of a framework which will enable us to discuss these things together. Then we can do the balance between security and other issues. We said it in the strategic evaluation of the Institute. We think that the state of Israel has to give priority and to deal with the internal problems. On the other hand, of course, the security threats have not gone anywhere. And in general, we have to maybe deviate the attention also to the inside. So it's not two separate boxes, it's just one box. Another issue that's coming up in the questions that people asked us relating to the survey of INSS. There's such an atmosphere that the Israeli democracy is in jeopardy, that you have to guard the democracy. And we saw in the survey that the public gives a high value to democracy. I'm sure democracy is a different issue to many people. Do you think that democracy is at risk because of the coronavirus crisis, if it prolongs. I think democracy is not in risk, but I think it's sort of fragile. You have to look at it all the time. I think that our democracy is now experiencing a crisis, not just because of the virus, but a political crisis that the virus sort of hitchhiked on it. And I think that the virus underscored some of the problems. During the pandemic, there was jeopardizing of a lot of basic rights. We have to be just 1 kilometer from house. You have to close your business. The Shabak can listen to us and detect us. But I think, and there's a potential here to a great damage. What balanced this damage is the fact that we still have a system which includes a democratic of checks and balances and also supervision of the authorities. And we saw it very nicely. The fact that in the executive arm you have gatekeepers. So the head of the Shabak himself, he is a factor that he himself has a commitment to democracy, and he's a gatekeeper so that nobody ill uses it. He wanted to be released from this responsibility. Yes, but if there was somebody else who was a political appointment, who wasn't bothered with what's good for the state, but more bothered about what people will think about it, maybe he wouldn't be such a good gatekeeper. So it shows the importance of those civil servants. The civil servants, these professionals, and we see it in the finance ministry and also the attorney general, all these professional civil servants guard from inside that even in such an emergency, we don't exaggerate and take advantage of the power of the government for ill use. And there are also external gatekeepers. And we saw even here, Knesset, which is actually functioning. There are problems, but that's the role of the Knesset. We got used to the fact that the Knesset became a rubber stamp of the government. But of course, the courts are a very important factor to guard democracy. There's a lot of criticism. Some of them are just, maybe we have to have a discourse about it. But an independent legal system is critical, and we see it in Hungary, in Poland, because now the regimes there, the first thing they did was throw away the justices and appoint different justices. And the next thing is Hungary is to jeopardize rights of workers or women. So we see how the gatekeepers have to be there, otherwise it's very dangerous to democracy, and their power is essential. I would continue with this with another question. Can we see phenomena like we saw in these states, that a mass storms the Knesset or doesn't accept the results of elections? Somebody asked also regarding that. Somebody asked us, Yaakov, I think, and it has to do with the same thing, about the mind engineers. Who are these mind engineers? These are the ones who don't allow the state to govern. What is this whole event of mind engineers, people who take the law in their hands? You started with a question, is it possible for a mass storming of the Knesset? First of all, from the professional world that have been the intelligence for many years, it can happen. Yes, that's an intelligence guy saying. Having said that, no, we cannot anticipate these things. We know how to think about it, and that definitely is an outline that you have to take into account. If you're asking me what I'm bothered by, I'm bothered by the fact that the basic infrastructure is undermined that enabled us to make decisions. When we talk about cyber, we're talking about critical infrastructure. I'm not talking about electricity, water. I'm talking about liberal Western state, the infrastructure of a market of ideas that you can dispute or you can discuss. This infrastructure today is undermined. It is undermined through all sorts of impact campaigns on the mind in the social media and in the behavioral sciences. So that's what we saw in the Capitol Hill. This is an alarm clock. We didn't need it. We saw it in other places, how words can convince and bring about deeds. The whole system has to be very sensitive to that, and we too, as a public, we have to understand that these things can happen. And by the way, they happened in the past. We had a storming of the Knesset once during the compensation discussions with the Germans at the time, but today it's more prevalent because of the dynamics of the social media, the no filtering, our possibility to communicate with people who think like us and do things with them. And I want to go over to another question. People ask whether at all the state is changing. State of Israel, it's reflected in the behavior of the ultra-orthodox. There's no longer mutual solidarity or joint goals. Maybe we're something else already. I always remind you that the rifts in the Israeli society has been discussed for many years. It's not anything new. But surely I think that there is a challenge to solidarity. And by the way, in the first lockdown, we saw a lot of solidarity, social. Even within this year, we had ups and downs in solidarity. But I think that the COVID-19 did underscore the conflict with the Haredi community, the ultra-Orthodox. It was up and down, and now but it is bothering us because it's growing. You know, this is a population that's really growing. They're isolated. The fact that they have a system that does not accept the rules of law. I don't have to elaborate. Everybody knows it. No, we are not generalizing. It's not all of them. No, it's not all of them. The fact that there is a group that lives this way, and by the way, I think that a lot of the Orthodox themselves respect the rules of the coronavirus in order to guard themselves, really in very difficult circumstances, such condensed life. But there is a system that they are maybe the victims of all sorts of rabbis who give them orders. And I think this is something we have to discuss and deal with. I think one of the things that were really underscored, we have to stop sweeping under the carpet these problems, and that is the Haredi society. But vis-à-vis the Arab society, I see that the virus, on the contrary, it took out a lot of good. There's a lot of rapprochement. I think many Israelis, maybe because a lot of the Arabs are in the medical profession, and mutual faith, and all of a sudden the Arabs saw their home front is coming to help them. I think this is a wonderful opportunity, and I think we have to deal with the violence in the Arab society. We neglected that. Maybe one conflict will be able to solve. Since the time is running, I would like to ask each of you, Itai, and then if you could make a decision now, a real significant decision, what would you do, Itai, assuming that your decision is going to have an impact on the nation? Maybe I would connect with the first thing we spoke about. It's easy to say that you have to invest in education or health to empower them. But I think that the most significant decision that we have to make is to create that framework that will enable to make decisions in times of crisis. Of course, you have to make decisions in routine life, but we saw in the coronavirus crisis a stable system that can make decisions in crises. And Pnina, what do you say? I think that the issue of the Haredi community, the ultra-Orthodox, and integrating them in the society, teaching them the core subjects, this is something that has to be in the highest order of priority for our future and the future of our children. Well, had I summarized this entire evening we had, because now we're going to go over to other things that have to do with politics, and until this minute we tried to be professional, I would raise 7 important points that came up this evening. First of all, that we have to change the order of priorities. We have to go towards economy, society, and welfare. The second thing, to reduce the centralization of the government, to delegate authorities to councils, to the communities. The third thing, which is most important at the moment, is occupational safety. Upgrading the labor market, raising the production, that people will be sure that they have a place of work. The other thing is a mechanism, apart from decision-making, also a mechanism for managing national crises that refers to all these rhinos we spoke about before. They don't try to create something in 5 minutes, but to deal with it seriously and efficiently. Determination in inculcating law and order and dealing with the enclaves and education, not to neglect it, to focus on it. Technology is going to be the wave that will make Israel capable of coping better with all the crises. All these things we discussed during this day, but beyond everything, we need leadership. Leadership that can decide to implement and also to survive after they decide. And the fact that we have elections every half a year, that does not enable to deal thoroughly with any of the problems we mentioned. Thank you for the questions, and I wish you an interesting